Good evening, guys. In the last session, we discussed about what is Spring Boot. Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. So earlier, we developed our applications by using Spring. Spring released into market in the year of 2003. In the Spring framework, we need to take care of a lot of configurations to develop our application, and those configurations are common in several projects. To overcome those configurations, Spring team developed Spring Boot and released in the year of 2014. So Spring Boot is not a replacement for the Spring. This Spring Boot is developed on top of Spring framework. All Spring framework concepts also we can use in the Spring Boot also. So Spring Boot is just one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. What are the advantages of going for the Spring Boot? No XML configurations. We don't need to do any XML configuration in the Spring Boot, and it is completely annotation-based configurations. And the second one is form starters. In the Spring Boot, dependencies are simplified by using form starter. So if you add a form starter, it will take care of all the dependencies and settings to develop our project. Auto configuration. Whatever the configuration that is required for our project, that will be taken care by Spring Boot only. And embedded servers. When we create a project, embedded server will be available to run our application. You no need to set up the server externally to deploy our application. Okay. And actuators. Actuators are used for production ready features. By using actuators, we can get the production ready features. We can monitor and manage our application by using actuators. Okay. So the Spring Boot first version came into market in the year of 2014. The current version of the Spring Boot is 3.x version. Now, how many ways are available to create the Spring Boot application? There are two ways available to create the Spring Boot application. Okay. Right. What are those two ways? What are the two ways to create the Spring Boot application? One is Spring Initializer website, and the second one is by using starter project in the IDE. If you create starter project in the IDE, internally it will communicate with the initializer website only. Okay, guys, fine. Internet connection is mandatory for the system to create the boot application. And when we are creating the boot application, what are the options it is asking? Build tool, it will ask. Language, it is going to ask us. Group ID, it is going to ask. Artifact ID, it will ask. Version and package name. Build tool, that means, do you want to use Maven or Gradle for that? Language means, do you want to use Java or Groovy or Kotlin? Group ID means company name. Artifact ID means project name, and version, package name, it is going to ask. And yesterday, we created our boot application in the IDE, and we are able to run the boot application. When we run the boot application, we are getting Spring logo as the output. It is printing on the console. Okay, now today we need to understand what is the folder structure of the Spring Boot application. Right, Spring Boot application folder structure. Spring Boot application folder structure. Spring Boot application folder structure. All right. Now, whenever we create the boot application, we can see one folder with a name called SRC main Java, and we can see SRC main resources folder will be available. SRC test Java will be available, and SRC test resources will be available, and Maven dependencies will be available, and the pom.xml file will be available. So basically this is the folder structure for our Spring Boot application. SRC main Java, SRC main resources, SRC test Java, test resources, Maven dependencies, and pom.xml. So this SRC main Java, it contains to keep our source code. Whatever the source code we are developing in our project, that source code we need to keep up. That source code we need to keep inside the SRC main Java folder. The core business logic, the classes that we are developing in the project, those classes we are going to keep in the src main Java folder. Now, in this src main Java folder, one package is created by default and one class also will be created that is called application.java. It is start class of the Spring Boot. It is start class of the Spring Boot. So what is the meaning of start class of the Spring Boot? Application execution will start from this start class. This is also called as main class in the Spring Boot. When we create the boot application, src main Java folder will be created. Src main Java folder is used to keep our project source code. Now, inside that main Java folder, by default, one class will be created. That class name will be application.java. So what is the purpose of that application.java? Application.java is called as start class of the Spring Boot. Spring Boot application execution will begin from application.java only. And the next one, src main resources to keep project configuration files. These are also called as resource files. Any property files or any YML files that you want to keep, you can keep that in the resources folder. By default, in the Spring Boot application, we will get one properties file with the name called application.properties. Instead of the properties, we can use YML configuration files also. If you want to keep your log configurations, if you want to keep any files, if you want to keep your SQL query files, if you want to keep your application messages, all those things we are going to keep as resources in the resources folder. Main Java folder contains the source code of the application. By default, when we create the project, we will get one class with a name called application.java. Application.java is called as start class of the Spring Boot, which is also called as main class in the Spring Boot. Along with main Java, main resources folder will be available. It is used to keep our project configuration files. By default, one file will be created in that folder, that is application.properties. Next one, src test Java to keep unit test code, to keep JUnit code. So which is used for unit testing purpose. So any code that is used to test your actual code. So here we are keeping our project source code. To test our project source code, we are going to use JUnits, right? That JUnit code we are going to keep in the src main, src test Java folder. src test Java folder we are using to keep our JUnit code. Okay, so by default here, one class will be created, which is application test.java. That will be created by default, which contains the logic to test our code. So in future, we are going to develop the unit testing for our classes. So unit testing logic we are going to keep in the test Java. Main source code we are going to keep in the main Java folder. So unit test related configuration files. Unit testing related config files goes here. Any configuration files that are required for executing our unit test cases in the project, those things we are going to keep in the test resources folder. Main resources will be available, test resources will be available. Main Java will be available, test Java will be available. Maven dependencies. So Maven jars, downloaded jars will be available here. Downloaded jars. So here we are adding form starters. Based on the form starters, it is going to download several dependencies. All the dependencies will be pointed in the Maven dependencies folder. Form.xml, Maven configuration file. Dependencies. What are the dependencies? What are the dependencies that we want to use in the project? Those dependencies we are going to declare in the form.xml. So if you go for a Gradle, build.gradle file will be available. If you go for Maven, form.xml file will be available. Suppose in my project, I want to use web development. So web starter dependency we need to add. Web starter dependency we need to add, right? So like that, what are the dependencies that are required for our project execution? Those dependencies we will declare in the form.xml. Then Maven will download those dependencies and will add the dependencies to build path. What are the dependencies it has downloaded? those dependencies we can see under Maven dependencies section. So any configuration files which are required for our project unit testing, those files will be available under test resources folder. And any code which is required for unit testing purpose, we'll keep that code in the test Java folder. When we create the boot application, by default, one test class also will be created. The test class name will be application test.java. And here main resources folder is available. It is used to keep our project configuration files. Application properties file will be created by default. Like I want to configure my project data source files, database configuration details, SMTP configuration details, any messages that are required for the application, all the information we are going to configure in these property files. Main Java folder, which contains our project source code. In that main Java folder, by default, application.java will be available. It is called start class of Spring Boot. What is the meaning of start class? Spring Boot application execution will start from the start class. So if you see the project, any Spring Boot application, one class will be available, which is application.java. That application.java class contains a main method that is the entry point for boot application. Whether it is a standalone application or whether it is a web application, whether it is a REST API, the execution will start from this class only, from the main method. Even though it is a web application, execution will start from here only. Even though it is a web application, execution will start from here only. This is called start class of the Spring Boot. Now you can directly execute this program. Boot application will start. Run as boot application. So when I run this application as boot, application execution started from main method. In this main method, it executed that logic. Now observe the start class clearly. This is entry point for boot application. In this start class, two important things are available. One is main method is calling run method, and this class is having one annotation called boot application annotation. Without this start class, Spring Boot application execution is not going to start. This start class is called as entry point for boot application. Now if you observe boot application annotation, this single annotation is equal to three annotations: boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. So this Spring Boot start class, that is very, very important. Boot application execution will begin from here only. So what is the start class in the Spring Boot? Spring Boot start class. Spring Boot start class. It is the entry point for boot application execution. What is the start class? It is entry point for boot application execution. Start class is the entry point for Spring Boot application execution. Now, in this entry point, we can see there is one annotation and there is a main method. Main method is going to call by JVM. That main method is calling Spring application.run method. So how the run method is working internally and what is this boot application, that we need to understand. Spring Boot application annotation is equal to below three annotations. At the rate Spring Boot application annotation is equal to below three annotations. What are those three annotations? One is Spring Boot configuration and enable auto configuration, enable auto configuration, and a component scan. So when we create the boot application, by default project structure is created, and by default one start class is also created. So how we will represent this class as a start class? It is having at the rate boot application annotation and it is calling run method. Now this boot application annotation is equal to below three annotations. In the Spring, if you want that behavior, we need to write component scan annotation manually and we need to write configuration annotation manually. But you no need to write that configuration annotation. You no need to specify component scanning. That is the default behavior in the Spring Boot. That is the default behavior in the Spring Boot. Let's observe here. If I create one Java class in any package, what is the behavior? New class. I'm creating one class with a name called user service. I'm creating one class with a name called user service, and I'm keeping that inside service package. Okay, I'm representing this class as a service, user service class, by using service annotation. Now, let me write one constructor to understand object is created or not. System.out.println system.out.println user service constructor. Now I just created a class and I represented that class as a service class. That's it. So am I writing the logic to start the IOC container? Guys, can you observe? Am I writing any logic here to start the IOC container? Am I writing any logic to start the IOC container? No. Am I writing any configuration class to perform component scanning? Am I writing any configuration class to perform component scanning? No. Just I created my boot application. One start class is available. I created one user service class. I represented that class as a Spring Bean by using annotation. Now, just to run this application, run as boot application. Can you see? Object is created. Guys, can you see that object got created or object is not created? Object is created or object is not created? Created. Did I create that object or my IOC created that object? Did I create that object? My IOC container created that object? I created that object or IOC created that object? I created the object or IOC created that object? IOC container created that object. So did I started the IOC container or I have not started the IOC container? Did I start the IOC container? I have not started. I have not started. So can we achieve this functionality in the Spring framework? Can we achieve this functionality in the Spring framework? No. In the Spring framework, we need to create a configuration class and we need to tell to that class to perform component scanning and start the IOC container, give the configuration class as the input for the IOC container. But here we no need to do anything because of auto configuration. We no need to do anything because of auto configuration. Okay, now guys, I'm creating user service class in a service package. Similarly, let me create new class, some user DAO. I'm creating this class inside the DAO package. Okay, to represent this class as a DAO, I'm using repository annotation. Now let me write one constructor and let me specify system.out.println sysout. User DAO I'm giving as constructor. So repository, I'm representing this class also as a Spring Bean by using repository annotation. So let's run our application, run as Spring Boot application. Run as Spring Boot application. Can you see? DAO object is created, service object also created. So can you see DAO object is created, service object also created? Yes, so that means, can I say component scanning is happening because of this annotation? Can I say component scanning is happening because of that annotation? Yes. So this Spring Boot application annotation is equal to below three annotations. One is boot configuration. Another one is auto configuration. Another one is component scan. And the next one, let me create one Java class in the util package. New class util, new class util. I'm creating a class with a name called password utils. Password utils class object I'm creating here. I'm writing constructor. I'm writing a constructor. Password utils constructor. I have not represented this class as a Spring Bean. So object will be created for this, or object will not be created for this class. For password utils class, object will be created or object will not be created. This is a normal Java class or this is a Spring Boot class. I mean Spring Bean class. It is a normal Java class. Object will not be created. Run as boot application. Check it. For password utils, object is created or object is not created. For password utils, object is not created. Okay, now I will go to start class. Here I will write a method. Public pwutils get instance, some logic, return new password utils. Now I'm writing one method. This method is annotated with @bean. So what is the purpose of @bean? Come on guys, what is the purpose of @bean? What is the purpose of @bean? To create the object on our own. To inform the IOC to call that method. Consider that object as a Spring Bean object. So am I writing @configuration annotation for the class to call this method? Am I writing @configuration annotation to call this method? No. Run as boot application. Now see, method is executed or method is not executed. Guys, can you see method is executed or method is not executed? Method is executed. So can I say boot start class will act as a configuration class by default? Guys, can I say boot start class will act as a configuration class by default? Yes, because of this annotation. Can I say component scanning is by default enabled in the Spring Boot? Yes, because of this annotation. So whatever the things we need to configure manually in the Spring, those things are automated in the Spring Boot. So can I say boot is one approach to develop the application with less configuration? Guys, can I say boot is one approach to develop the application with less configuration? Whatever the configuration that we need to do manually, that configurations are automated in the Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring based application with less or minimal configurations. Okay. So as we have Spring Boot start class will act as configuration class because of @Spring Boot configuration annotation. Spring Boot start class will act as configuration class because of Spring Boot configuration annotation. Now, auto configuration will be enabled in the Spring Boot because of enable auto configuration. In Spring Boot application, auto configuration feature will be available. auto configuration feature will be available because of enable auto configuration annotation. Because of enable auto configuration annotation. Component scanning is by default enabled in the Spring Boot because of @component scan. Component scan will be enabled. Component scanning will be performed in the Spring Boot. Because of @component scan annotation. In the start class, we have one annotation that is called Spring Boot application annotation. That Spring Boot application annotation is equal to 3 annotations: @configuration, Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. So here, that start class will be acting as a configuration class by default. So you can configure your bean methods in that class. It is having boot configuration annotation. In Spring Boot application, auto configuration feature will be available because of that enable auto configuration annotation. Component scanning will be performed because of @component scan annotation. Can you guys tell me what is a component scan in the Spring Boot? Can you guys tell me what is component scanning? It will find the bean classes which are available in the project. Suppose, for example, if I remove this annotation, then what will happen? Can we remove that annotation from the class? If I remove that annotation from the class, then what will happen, guys? If I remove that annotation, then what will happen? Come on. If I remove that annotation, then what will happen? Run as boot application. If I remove that annotation, can you see component scanning is happening or not happening? Guys, it is creating only current class object. It is creating only current class object. Component scanning is happening or component scanning is not happening? Component scanning is not happening. So writing this annotation is mandatory or it is optional in the Spring Boot? Writing that annotation is mandatory or optional? Mandatory. Writing that annotation is mandatory. Okay, guys, auto configuration, component scan, all that stuff will be available for the Spring Boot application because of this annotation. We should not remove this annotation from start class in the Spring Boot. This annotation will provide you all the configuration component scan for the start class in the Spring Boot. Start class nothing but that is the entry point for boot application execution. Start class nothing but that is the entry point for boot application execution. So Spring Boot application executions will start from this start class only. Spring Boot application execution will start from this class only. That is from the main method. Are you clear with these points? Just to see what is the folder structure of the project. Folder structure. Are you guys able to understand the folder structure? Are you guys able to understand the folder structure of the Spring Boot? Main Java. To keep the project source code, in that we will have application.java. It is the start class of the Spring Boot. Main resources, which is used to keep the project configuration files. Generally, application.properties or application.yml file, we will keep in the resources folder. Test Java, which is used to keep the JUnit code or unit test code of our application. By default, application test Java class will be created. Test resources, unit testing related config files will go here. Then Maven dependencies. Maven dependencies. Download the jars. Whatever the jars we are configuring, those jars will be configured here. Pom.xml. Maven configuration files, dependencies will be available here. Boot start class. So it is entry point for boot application execution. Boot application execution will start from here. Spring Boot application annotation will be there in the start class. That one annotation is equal to below 3 annotations: boot configuration, auto configuration, and component scan. Start class will act as a configuration class by default. Boot application auto configuration feature will be available because of that annotation. What is auto configuration? That means loading required classes which are used to run our application. Any configurations that are required to execute our project will be provided by Spring Boot because of auto configuration. Component scan will be performed in the boot because of component scan annotation. We already discussed what is component scan and how it is going to identify the bean classes, which annotations we are going to use to perform the component scanning. For component scanning, package naming convention will play very important role. Package naming convention will play important role in component scanning. Package naming convention will play important role in the component scanning. Suppose if we have base package, that means the package which contains the start class is called as base package. I'm giving base package as in.ashok.it. Now here, if we have in.ashok.it, in.ashok.it dot service, that is valid, it will consider that. And in.ashok.it.dao, it is valid, it will consider that. But when you write a package like this, com.ashok.it.util, this is invalid. The above two are valid because of that package naming convention. So in the component scanning, package naming convention will play very important role. We need to be very careful when we are working with packages in the boot application. Are you clear with the package naming conventions? Dhirendra Singh is asking why this is invalid. Invalid means will not scanned. Will not scan. This package will be scanned. This package also will be scanned because base package name should match. So as part of component scanning, it is going to identify the base package and sub packages of the base package. If our package name matches with the base package name, then only it will participate in the scanning. Otherwise, those packages will not participate in the component scanning. Are you clear? Are you guys clear? Now, next one. What is Spring application dot run method? What is Spring application dot run method? So Spring application dot run method is entry point for boot application. In Spring Boot start class main method, Spring Boot start class main method will call Spring application dot run method. Spring Boot start class main method Spring Boot start class main method will call Spring application dot run method. Boot start class main method will call Spring application dot run method. Spring application dot run method is called entry point for boot application execution. This Spring application dot run method is entry point for boot application execution. Boot application execution. This method will return the reference of IOC container. This run method will return reference of IOC. It is responsible to start the IOC container and it is responsible to return the reference of the IOC. So what is the return type of the run method? The run method return type is configurable application context. In the start class, main method is available. Inside the main method, we are calling Spring application.run method. So Spring application.run method will be called from the main method. This method is entry point for boot application execution. This run method will return reference of IOC. Reference of IOC. So lot of stuff will happen inside this run method, guys. So that internals we need to understand what is happening inside the run method, what exactly is executing inside the run method. So all this logic is executing inside the run method. So we need to understand the internal process of this run method. Run method only is printing the banner on the console. Run method only creating the IOC container. So whatever the default settings that we are getting, those settings are already configured in the run method. So we no need to start the IOC container. We no need to do anything in this because already inside the run method, that logic is available. Okay. So guys, today I'm having office meeting at 8:30 guys. So I'm closing our session little early. So tomorrow I am going to explain in detail about the run method. Even if I start it also, I cannot complete this method because it will take 30 to 40 minutes of time to understand the internals of the run method. So I'm not going to start that now because I have to close the session because I have a office meeting at 8:30. So in the tomorrow session, I will explain that Spring application.run method. Is that okay for everyone? Is that okay for everyone? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you guys. Thank you. Today I'm closing the session little early. Tomorrow I will compensate that. Tomorrow I will take 2 hours session. Okay, so because of my office meeting, I am closing the session little early. I will compensate this tomorrow. Tomorrow I will take the session for 2 hours. Okay, please practice this Spring Boot application creation and understand how boot application is working internally. What is the start class? What annotations are available for the start class? Component scanning is working or not? So here also you can configure multiple base package names. So by default, it will consider current class package name as a base package name. If you want to configure more than one base package also, you can do that. You can override the default behavior of that. You can configure component scan. You can configure base packages. Here also you can configure multiple base packages. Okay, so if you don't configure the component scan annotation, By default, it will consider the current class as a base package name. If you want to configure more than one base package, then you can configure them by using this annotation like this. All right. Yeah, please go through this one. And if you want to go through that start class run method, I have already uploaded a video. I will share that video in the group today. You can go through that, how that run method is working internally. You can understand. In the tomorrow session, I will explain that once again. Okay, guys. Fine. Thank you. Good night. We'll see you in the tomorrow's class. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.